Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan, and in this episode, I'm thrilled to have two people I respect quite a lot. They are veteran journalists. They ran newsrooms, they assigned features, and wrote a syndicated column between them. They publish a website called flyinglessons.us, which is about what we're learning from the birds. Beverly and Anders Gyllenhaal also happen to be husband and wife. And they are here to talk about their latest book, which is very aptly titled On a Wing and a Prayer. Welcome, Beverly and Anders. Thank you so much for being part of the Bird Podcast.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Shobha, for having us.
I mean, your book is very provocative. It's The Race to Save Our Vanishing Birds. I wanted to ask you to lay out the thesis of the book for people here in India or elsewhere who have not read it.
Sure, very good. So we began this book right after the 3 billion bird report. We began thinking about it because the idea that we had lost a third of our birds was just such a profound thing, and we felt like there was a story there, and people were reacting to it as if, okay, this is the new normal. But we thought, this is a stunning discovery, and there are a lot of questions that flow from that. Is this going to continue? Is there any way to, how can it be adjusted? What are the options here to try to prevent another loss of a third of the birds? So we try to answer the question, what is being done, and there's projects all over the hemisphere that are compelling. So we spend time on several different deep looks at the most effective projects
in North America.
And we had to sort of focus on, we had to narrow it. That was big enough, for us. And that, of course, was where the report was focused, and also where a lot of the research we used is. So we gradually work our way in the book through the most important projects, and then try to say, where is all this going? What needs to be done in order to try to begin to halt this dramatic loss of birds? And that way we cover everything from agriculture to the technology that is at work here. And then we end up with a call to action in this book saying, it's going to take some significant changes. It's going to take some real public pressure, but all these things are within reach. And that's the point that we're trying to make, is that when you look at this slice of the environmental story, this can be done if we care about it. Now, this is focused on North America, but it's the same story across the world, right? You write about it all the time, and all the different versions, very much the same numbers even, of birds in trouble. So what have I forgotten in a summary of the book?
Gosh, sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah. You begin with a sparrow and an owl, the first chapter. And I agree with you that in a sense, after reading your book, it's a hopeful book. It's actually saying, yeah, you know what, guys, we can do this. But tell us about the sparrow and the owl in the opening chapter.
Right. Well, the sparrow is the Florida grasshopper sparrow, which officially is the most endangered bird on the mainland. And so we spent a lot of time trying to understand this story.
And this little bird was down to 22 breeding pairs when finally the folks, all of the consortium that were trying to figure out what to do about this, decided that now is the time. We've got to take drastic measures, because the last bird to go extinct on the mainland was also a Florida bird, the dusky seaside sparrow, and they had waited too long to start the captive breeding program. So they decided they would pull in some birds from the wild, which is always the problem. You only have 44 birds and you're going to bring some of them in. But they did that, and the rest is kind of history, right. But I'll let Anders tell you a little bit more about that.
Gradually, by captive breeding, by trying to figure out what exactly these birds need. They've begun to rebuild the population. That's the sparrow story. And we took these two stories, the sparrow and the ivory-billed woodpecker, because one is a bird that nobody hardly ever sees and hardly knows about. And the other one is one of the most famous species. And we're not even sure, of course, what its status is. So we thought they sort of acted as bookends.
But it's the spotted owl, though. You're talking about the spotted
No,
owl.
on the question of, what can be done to try to deal with birds that are on the edge of extinction. And so that's part of the message, is that is an area where the costs are the highest, the odds are the longest, and that's where we spend so much of our time, as opposed to focusing on birds before they're in the kind of deep trouble that both of these birds are in.
Yeah. One of our early interviews was with Dr. Jerry Jackson, who is an expert on the ivory-billed woodpecker as well.
Yeah.
So then you dive right into the shocking statistic about 1/3 of the birds dying, and that was a very interesting chapter. Can you talk about that? Expand on that? And one of the researchers is called Adam Smith, and like the old Adam Smith, the author and economic writer.
Right.
Well, basically, the thing that drove this was the fact that for a long time, many people had been counting birds, of course, and trying to figure out, okay, are the birds doing well? Which ones are in trouble? Which ones aren't? How bad is it? And nobody really actually knew whether there were as many as birds as there have always been, or there's a few more, a few less. And finally, somebody said, well, what would happen if we could put a real number on it? And thanks to new algorithms and some other technological breakthroughs, they went to the computers, these giant, computers, and ran a lot of data that they were able to use the old data going back to the first bird counts, combined with eBird data, radar data, and just pretty much were able to come up with algorithms that said, okay, the actual number is almost 3 billion birds, 2.911000, whatever, the actual decimal point was.
Lost, yeah. And we thought it was important to reconstruct that research because it shows, how complicated it is. It's enormously complicated, but it is also the kind of precision that they were able to bring to this is very convincing that this is the nature of our birdscape. So we rebuilt that, and then also along the way sort of got across these long time scientists sort of realizing that the topic they've devoted their lives to is eroding at this pretty remarkable case, and what can be, and that sort of sets up the question of, well, what can be done?
Correct. So in your opinion, what can be done?
Yes, and
well, it's probably good to sort of think about maybe the way we got started with the project, because that was the question that, we had to sort of figure out. And the way we did that was we are not bird researchers ourselves. As you said, we're journalists. And the only way that we really know how to get to the bottom of something is to talk to a lot of people and ask a lot of questions. So we decided that we would go and see what currently is being done and to try to get a real sense of that. So we loaded ourselves up into a little travel trailer, 23 feet long, in the middle of the pandemic. And we started at home and in North Carolina, and we went to Florida, and then we drove all the way to California and across California and parked the trailer for a while, and then went to Hawaii to check that out, then drove all the way back home. And what we found were these projects spread across the country like pieces of a puzzle, where the most endangered birds, the ones that are particularly listed on the Endangered Species Act, are getting a lot of attention, time, and resources. So what can be done is a lot of new technological advances are really helping scientists figure out not only where birds are, but where they run into problems where they are. And when they figure out where they're in trouble, a lot of the times they can figure out why they're in trouble.
Yeah. And one of the things we try to get across in this is we look at cases where it is working. And a great example of that, and it's sort of a surprising one, is the U.S. military. So the military, which at first did not want to have to accept the responsibility of being a nursemaid for birds. They have other things they're trying to do. But it turned out that the law was imperative that they had to take care of birds. And of course, what's so interesting is that as the country developed, the bases became kind of islands of open land where more than 500 endangered species, not just birds, live. So the military got into trouble for failing at first to care for these species, and then it sort of did this about face and said, okay, we are going to make this a priority. And in the case of the red-caulcated woodpecker, which is is featured in one of these chapters, they take a bird that was perhaps the pickiest bird. It could only live in old growth pines. It wants the wood to be half rotten before it builds its cave. So it was in effect doomed because those trees were basically gone.
At one point, there were 92 million of these trees. They're called longleaf pines. And these were the same trees that were really good for producing pitch and turpentine and tar. So a lot of these trees were cut for the turpentine industry. And then, of course, for development, the same story as in many other parts of the world. A natural resource that was very valuable to humans was also needed by these birds. But it just so happens that this one particular bird just simply couldn't live anywhere else. So it was down, to the last few trees, except for the ones on the southern military bases.
So the military figured out how to create man-made cavities to support these birds, which then gradually began to rebuild their populations on these bases and elsewhere. And now the red-caulcated woodpecker is about to graduate from the endangered species list. And we think that's a great example of, if the military, which is, training for conflict and war and middle of bombing ranges, can keep a bird healthy, then the rest of us ought to be able to do that too. And they showed that with not a huge investment of research, but focused research to figure out what this bird needs, you can rebuild that species, even the most imperiled species. And so there's several cases like that we found that make the point that this is possible if we are willing to recognize how important birds are.
As journalists and editors, you will understand this, and I usually plug episodes linked to what our current guest is saying, in the hope that people go back and listen to that episode. And I'll be doing the same with your episode in the forthcoming ones. But one of our episodes, episode 50 with Professor Yossi Leshem, talks about how the Israeli Defense Force, Israel, as you probably know, is one of the biggest migrating corridors in the world. And the birds, like golden eagles, were routinely running into the Israeli Defense Force planes, fighter planes. And there's another successful story about using the military to protect birds.
Right.
It's not the first thing that would come to mind, when you think about it.
And, another great example, we go into some depth on this too, are the success of ducks and geese and game bird practices. Correct. Which, the ducks and geese were imperiled as well in the 30s after the Dust Bowl years and droughts wiped out most of these birds. And it just so happened that there were a segment of the duck hunters then and now who were well-heeled, politically connected folks who said, we're not going to let these birds disappear. And they built, policies and figured out how to raise money through taxes on ammunition and bows and arrows and guns, and figured out how to fund a wholesale policy to save ducks and geese and other game birds. Other birds benefit from that as well, but it's an example of what can be done if you gear up both funding and political force and go after it. So one of the questions we also ask is, well, why can't this be extended to other groups of birds that are in trouble? Now that's a complicated question, because there's a lot of things about ducks and geese that are unique. The 500 plus refuges that are in place across the country are a big part of that. But it's a question I think we have to sort of answer that. Why can't you take the models that are working and apply them more broadly? Because that's the nature of this problem now.
Yes. I wanted to ask you to talk about two things in relation to that. One is the resurgence of bald eagles in America. And I read the chapter and I was thinking, does it have to do with the size of this magnificent raptor and the resonance that it has to the American people, which you talked about just now, is why can't you extend it? So does it have to do with the type of bird species that gets saved? And please also talk about scrub jays in Florida, because it's a sort of a balance between these birds that people see as pesky and the real estate development that people think is urgent and needs to happen.
Yeah.
So
by all means.
Well, one of the real tricky things about all of this is that a lot of the times you've seen one bird. You've heard the story of that bird and it's unique. And this is part of the problem for birds, is that they're all, they're not alike. They don't all need the same things. And when the eagles took their real dive, it was mostly because of the pesticide DDT. And, it wasn't only the eagles that were almost extinct because of this pesticide. It was also other raptors and other shorebirds like the pelican and the osprey and the peregrine falcons. So lots of birds were, in this particular case, suffering from the same ailment. And once they banned the DDT, slowly but surely the population started to build. But because the eagle is the national symbol, it's not our national bird, it's our national symbol, and has been since the 1700s. There's a real love for this particular bird, and it's magnificent. Who wouldn't be in love with an eagle? It's something you can actually see with the naked eye. You don't need to have binoculars or a scope if you just happen to be in an environment. And now, thanks to mostly good laws and particularly banning this awful pesticide, the eagles are now found in all 50 states. Well, on the mainland, not Hawaii, but all the others, right. Every state except Hawaii. And so basically with the eagle, he was a lucky bird. He could fly, he goes everywhere. He's basically a scavenger. He's at the top of the food chain. And in certain ways, he's almost like an easy case when you consider, some of the things these other birds are going up against. But anyhow, so that, I think the reason that the eagle has been protected is not only they found the true culprit, but B, we do have very strong laws protecting that one particular bird. It has its own special law, aside from the Endangered Species Act, to protect it.
Yeah.
Contrast that with some normal birds.
Okay. And that's part of the way this works, is that birds with high stature that are popular, and often birds that are larger, just because they are seen more easily. Great blue herons and whooping cranes and California condors. A lot of the birds that are at the top of the list have had a real focus on them. Whereas a lot of other birds that people don't see, the Florida grasshopper sparrow is a great example of that. That it's harder to make the case. People don't care as much, and I think part of our job in trying to tell this story is to recognize that the entire birdscape in all its different forms is vital for the balance of nature, and so you can't pick and choose birds and expect that that's going to make everything be okay. And so we try to make the case that all these birds have a place, and they all play different roles, as Beverly mentions, in pollination and spreading seeds and fertilizing the oceans and lands,
eating insects,
and eating the insects. So 400 to 500 pounds of insects, 500,000 pounds, tons rather, I'm sorry, a year that they consume. So the roles that they play are across all the species.
Yeah. And even the cerulean warbler, which you talk about, is the tiniest of birds and hardly visible. We have warblers in India as well, and they're a pain to spot. But you talk, can you talk about that chapter where you go to Ecuador and there's this corridor that you talk about, Choco corridor.
Well, it started out for us with trying to find it at home. And we just could never see this bird. He was so elusive. And as you're saying, they can be really difficult to spot. And he's such a beautiful blue and white bird. She is the same. I mean, they actually almost look the same, which is unusual. But anyway, they're really cool birds, but they're in a lot of trouble because their habitat, not only here, is really compromised, but they are one of these birds that we share with the other side of the hemisphere. And so they migrate this very long distance twice a year. And regardless of what we're doing with them in North America, it doesn't really matter if they go and they migrate and there's nowhere for them to be when they get there. So this just sort of is another whole class of issues that we have for our migrating songbirds, all migrating birds, but we're talking about the cerulean being a songbird. So,
and so, it's hard enough when the issues are within the boundaries of one country. When you're expecting, 12 South American countries and 3 Canada, Mexico, US. To work together, we sort of compare the cerulean to a child of divorced parents. Neither side really wants to take that responsibility. They don't work very well together, and in lots of ways, the migrators are among the hardest hit. However, there is progress, ironically, to some extent, coming from the realization that climate change, it requires preservation of much more land than we have been doing, including in both South and North America. So real money now is going into different countries in South America from the big foundations to say, we need to do something about climate change, and birds are the beneficiaries of that, we hope, in the long run. We see that in Ecuador, which was sort of the country we thought we would tell the story from. So we trace the cerulean, back and forth and look at what both countries are doing to try to prevent them, but from further losses. But they're not doing enough is the conclusion of that chapter.
And you use a very shocking line. You say Hawaii is the extinction capital of the world, and I hadn't intuited that. And do you think this can change?
Well, that's a great question because, what's happening in Hawaii may or may not be a look at the future. There's things about Hawaii that are very different. It's a unique place. It has been overrun with invasive species of all kinds that are, part of the problem. But it's also a paradise of, unparalleled beauty in these birds that are so unique and exotic. And we try to make the argument that more attention ought to be paid to this because it's a far away place. It's different than the rest of the U.S. They haven't gotten the resources that are that would be, you could argue should be going there because of the nature, the number of, endangered species there. And now, have this issue with forest birds that are succumbing to avian malaria as the temperatures increase and mosquitoes are moving up the mountains into the areas where the remaining birds are. And so this massive project is getting ready to launch this next year that will release Wolbachia infused birds, which is a bacteria that in effect acts as a birth control to try to stop the spread of avian malaria. And that's I think an example of kind of the extremes that Hawaii is trying out. And that may be because of that, because they're in such dire shape. An example of that is that there were 140 species in Hawaii unique to the islands. 100 of them are gone. And so you're dealing with 2/3 of their species have vanished. And now is the time to do something. So we try to make the argument that this is a place to put real resources.
Or a place that you can look at and say, well, if you're that far on the edge, this is what it looks like. This is what sort of bird dystopia starts to look like. Because most of the birds that tourists who go to Hawaii see, those aren't native birds. They were brought in because their native forest birds went higher and higher up. There were no birds where people were living. There was no bird song. So basically, wealthy people got together and went around the world and bought some and brought them home so they would have birds. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a cautionary tale, I think, in a way, also.
Yeah. So if you had to give a bird's eye view of the problem, and I'll later ask you about the solution. So in conservation, we hear about habitat. So how would you break down the issues, the urgent issues that are the problem that these birds are facing?
Well, as we went across the country, we kept hearing we're down to 3% of this habitat. We're down to 2% of that habitat. We're down to 1% of this type of habitat. So much percentage of the wetlands are gone. The grasslands have been, changed over to farming. And it was the story that we just heard over and over again. And so for birds that are more adaptable, that can eat broader things, they can live in more places, they're going to be the last birds to fall, say.
Yeah.
But birds like the red-cockaded woodpecker that we were talking about that can only live in one tree. Or we also have little warblers that can only use one type of ash juniper bark to weave its nest. And they're so specific. And that's birds all over the world. I'm sure that you probably have tons of those where you live in India as well, that just couldn't be easily moved. But the birds that don't migrate in particular, that evolved in such a narrow habitat with such a very specific need, and we've wiped out the habitat. It's just basically not there. So that's one huge issue.
And so habitat is an important thing. But one of the things that we heard and it resonated and we thought was a really interesting point was that there was a time when it was thought, well, birds and other wildlife are protected over there away from where people are, and people live here. And these are two separate worlds. And I think one of the concepts that we're seeing that's really important is that birds and people can coexist in all kinds of environments if we just recognize that we both need things and that it isn't that hard to provide them. And examples of that, go all the way to agriculture, which is certainly one of the big barriers to creating, habitat that serves birds. But there's, a movement, as you well know, to try approaches that make room for birds on farms. We tell the story of the Flint Hill ranchers who figured out that if they are putting in the kind of plants, if they're doing the kind of ranching, if they're keeping away from pesticides, birds will flood back in and they'll have a more productive ranch. And we camped there for a couple of days, and sure enough, there were birds everywhere in the middle of a cattle ranch. And the same thing goes for cities. If we can turn off the lights during migration, if we can mitigate these high-rise buildings that are causing, 1 billion birds a year to crash and many of them die. If we can deal with the feral cat problem, which is a complicated one where we've made almost no progress. If you put all that together, you can begin to have real impacts. But it sort of starts with the recognition that we have built a world, and India as well as the US want to be superpowers. That takes a lot. We're not going to change that. We've built a world that is created for human needs, but there is room for birds and other wildlife if we will do some of these things, and we'll all be a lot better off. Now, that's it may sound a little simplistic, but it's the sort of the message that has to get across to a wider audience.
Yeah. In episode 14, I interviewed Chris Wood from eBird, who you write about as well. And he talked about how the California farmers can be incentivized to let their rice fields lay fallow during migrating season. So Anders, you just outlined a few points about what is possible for solutions. Would you like to say some more? Are there other examples you'd like to touch upon?
Yeah, absolutely. We both have some things to add to this. You had asked about the Florida scrub jay, and I think that's a good example of where technology can make a big difference. What the scrub jays need is, like all these birds, habitat that they can survive on, but that habitat's been cut up in smaller and smaller pieces in Florida. So the challenge is, how do they live in limited range? And how do they connect these sort of isolated habitats so that these birds can move around and find mates? And so what's happened in Florida is they said, let's track every move these birds make all day long. They don't migrate. They're resident birds. So they're tracking everything that they do to study, well, what do the birds like best? And they're focusing mostly on their sort of teenage, call them, years, where they're starting to look for mates. And they figure out what exactly they need in terms of how the habitat is burned and cured by fire, what kinds of plants work best for them, how do you connect these corridors, and that's something that the state of Florida has done a good job of. And so this is still at its earliest stages, but it's a good example of where technology, by understanding exactly the details of what these birds need, you can come up with solutions. And technology itself isn't going to solve the problem, but it opens windows that otherwise we wouldn't have. And the technology is very interesting. We're watching birds from space now, and through satellites, and through all kinds of the whole tower system that's now spread all over the MODIS system, spread all over the U.S., as Latin America, and in Europe, and in India. And so we're learning how to follow these birds in a way to figure out what they need.
Yeah. There's this very poignant, so technology is one, of course, habitat loss you've talked about. And I wanted to ask you about this emotional resonance, because we save what we like, I guess, as humans, or what we can connect with. And you have this great line where you say it's really hard because birds are designed to camouflage themselves. So for the non-bird watcher, it's very hard to create this connection because they really don't want to be seen.
Sure.
Can you talk about other sort of interesting problems or solutions? I mean, there's one chapter where you talk about the California spotted owl, where people are using sound.
That is another area of technology that's had enormous impact very quickly. And it dates back to the First and Second World War, tracking German subs how do you use sound to figure out where, in this case, armaments are, and gradually migrated over to using birds, because bird songs, are constant. So you can figure out where birds are and what they are doing based on recording their sounds. This was coming along over decades gradually, and then the algorithms were released by the big internet companies that allowed instantaneous searches, which meant that you could take millions of hours is what you need of recordings of birds, process them overnight, and see maps of where they are. And that's what they've used in the Sierra Nevadas in California to try to stabilize the spotted owl. And that's another case where it's working. You can figure out what these owls need, and they think the population is going to be probably drop a little bit more and then begin to rise again. Another thing that brings up is the power of these tools like bioacoustics and eBird, and to connect people to birds. And so what we see as birders is this helps me see where birds are. But as we all know, this is also collecting data that then goes back to the researchers, particularly Cornell, that they are using to figure out where birds are, where they're going, et cetera. And it creates a connection that I think answers the question you were asking, which is, how do people and birds, how do we care more about them? Well, we know more about them, we see them. So all these technologies are helping with that connection we think you can see. There's 700,000 eBirders now, right, around the world. That means there's room for many more.
Yeah.
What about your being on the birding trail and you're sort of an ambassador for eBird?
Well, if you want to learn to be a birder, if you do want to figure out where these birds are, eBird is, in my opinion, a wonderful way to go about it. It's like having a little bird guide in your back pocket some of the time.
And Merlin too.
And Merlin, of course, but as a birder themselves. But what you were saying about I think partly what you're saying is, or asking perhaps, is how can we care about something we don't see?
Yeah.
When you can see birds, and people are just fascinated when they do see them. And when you give someone a pair of binoculars and show them how to use them and to see the bird, people are just astonished. They just love these close-ups with the birds. But the thing I think that we have to understand as people is thinking about the fact that one of the bird's functions before a lot of electronics was the canary in the coal mine. The story of the miners who would take the canaries down into the mine, and if the bird was healthy and happy, the miners were healthy and happy. And if the bird suddenly stopped singing, fell off its perch, the miners knew they had to flee the mine. They had to get out, right? Because it wasn't healthy. And what we heard over and over from a lot of the scientists that we talked with is that the birds are telling us that the environment isn't good for them, right? These losses point to the fact that things are not happy in the bird world. And so whether it's pesticides or climate change or what the problems are, they're coming for humans next, And so if we have a farm that's healthy for birds, we have a better farm. If we have, any environment where the birds are doing well, more than likely people have a better chance of doing well from a nature standpoint as well.
Yes. The last couple of questions, I ask all my guests what their favorite bird species are, or something that resonates with them, either an anecdote or a bird or a few species. So I'm going to ask you the same thing.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people tell you it's like picking out a favorite child. For me, I just have a real soft spot for the cerulean warbler, just partly because it was sort of hard to find. And I just think that it's a beautiful bird. And when we finally found it, and got to take pictures of it, I felt like somehow life was complete, pretty much. It was just a real moment of pride for me that we finally found that bird. And in the book, I wrote a little essay about that. So I won't take the time now, but I wrote a whole story about finding that bird. And that was like my little moment in the sun.
Yeah. And I think I might mention the great blue heron, where is a chapter in the book about taking photos of herons, and I'm the photographer part of this, and I happened to catch a great blue in that amazing mating plumage that they have, and it's such a dramatic and mystical look that they adapt, and that's what the birds like, and I think that photography, the advances of photography are a really important piece of this challenge of getting the story out to the public. Because now there's as many cameras out there as there are binoculars, and there's a whole generation of amateur photographers, which is what we all are, but we're capable of better and better photos because of the equipment that helps to put people in sight of these birds that are hard to see. So I've loved the role of the photography, and the great photographers through history have helped to bring this story to people, and I think let people see birds and what they are. So I love the great blue for that reason.
You've answered my next question, which was going to be, can you talk about one small switch that can work amazingly? For example, in episode 13, the author Cy Montgomery talked about how switching from lead bullets to copper bullets saved the California condor. And so I think that you said photography, and it's photographers are sort of a complex part of the birding life, because some people like them and some people hate them, but you've made a case that they are necessary to bring the birds out front. So then I'll just say, any last words, or maybe I'll ask you to make a case for birds, which is what your book is about.
Yeah.
As an ending, yeah.
Well, the birds, sort of found us. We were living in Washington, D.C., in the middle of the city, and wrapped up in that sort of life, and we decided we needed to get out of town and breathe some fresh air. And while we were out there, we began to get interested in birds little at a time, and they sort of, in effect, made it impossible for us to ignore them, and that gradually turned into this obsession that our kids like to make fun of us for. But I think that birds will do a lot of the work if we'll look out the window and see them and get out and chase them. And look what happened during the pandemic.
The pandemic was a good example of this.
Suddenly people rediscovered birds in a way that just boosted the interest. They sold out of bird seed. The interest skyrocketed, including fishing and hunting as well, which is an important piece of all this. So I think if we'll give them a chance, birds will do a lot of the work of making their case for us. If we'll pay attention to them, they will captivate us, and I think remind us of how important they are. And
from you, Beverly, any last words?
Well, I think that my canary in the mine speech was kind of my sort of that thing. Yeah. That if we could appreciate the fact that birds are the harbinger of health of our environment, and so if we listen to what they're saying, we're not doing well. We're faltering. A third of us are gone, and really pay attention and stop and maybe kind of think about that and try to, those of us who do love birds and who do understand how important they are. There are 50 million bird watchers, or people who identify as bird watchers in the United States. And we all vote, and we all contribute to causes that we care about. And so I think that we need to do more.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that rousing call to action note, let me thank you both for being part of the Bird Podcast. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Shobha, for having us.
It's been a great pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for watching and listening.